Hey, so get this. They built the world's first underground railway using steam engines. Steam engines, underground, in tunnels with virtually no ventilation. Tonight we're exploring how Victorian London's marvel of engineering became one of history's most fascinating examples of ambitious technology meeting unexpected challenges. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. All right, find that cozy spot, take a nice slow breath, and just let yourself sink into whatever you're lying on. We're heading back to 1863 London, into the remarkable world of the first underground railway. And trust me, you're going to be so grateful for that fresh air and modern engineering around you by the time we're done. So let's explore this incredible story of Victorian innovation and determination. We'll follow the experiences of those who witnessed the birth of underground transportation in London. It's January 10th, 1863, and we're about to discover one of history's most remarkable examples of engineering brilliance tackling seemingly impossible challenges. The story begins with an idea that seemed absolutely revolutionary to most people who heard it. Charles Pearson, the chief solicitor of the City of London, had been proposing for years that the solution to London's horrific traffic congestion was to move the railways underground. In an age when people were still mastering the art of building safe structures above ground, he wanted to dig massive tunnels beneath one of the world's largest cities and run steam trains through them. London in the 1850s was overwhelmed by its own remarkable success. The population had exploded from around 1 million in 1800 to over 3 million by 1860, making it the largest city in the world. The streets were completely clogged with horse-drawn carriages, omnibuses, carts, pedestrians, and livestock being driven to market. Getting from one side of the city to the other could take an entire day, and the air above ground was thick with horse dust, coal smoke, and the general atmosphere of industrial civilization at its peak. But the real challenge was the railways. By the 1850s, London had multiple railway termini bringing passengers from all over Britain. But they all stopped at the edge of the city: Liverpool Street, King's Cross, Paddington, Victoria. These great iron and glass cathedrals of the railway age formed a ring around central London, but they weren't connected to each other. If you arrived at Paddington and needed to get to London Bridge Station, you had to somehow cross the entire city through those impossible traffic-clogged streets. This is where Charles Pearson's revolutionary idea began to seem less impossible and more essential. What if you could build a railway that connected these terminus stations by running underneath the city rather than trying to carve through it? What if passengers could travel from Paddington to King's Cross without ever seeing daylight, passing beneath all that surface chaos in fast, efficient underground trains? The engineering challenges were absolutely staggering. In 1863, mechanical engineering was still relatively young as a science. They had no electric lights, no sophisticated ventilation systems, no modern understanding of soil mechanics or groundwater management. The deepest mines in Britain were constantly flooded and required enormous steam-powered pumps running continuously just to keep them operational. The idea of building a passenger railway tunnel underneath a city seemed like attempting something that had never been tried before. But Charles Pearson and his supporters had one crucial advantage: Victorian confidence. This was the age of the Great Exhibition, of the Crystal Palace, of engineers who believed that human ingenuity could overcome any obstacle that nature might present. If they could build railways across mountains and bridges across rivers, surely they could dig tunnels under London and make them work. The Metropolitan Railway, as it came to be called, would run from Paddington Station in the west to Farringdon Street in the east, a distance of about 4 miles. The route would take it underneath some of London's most congested streets: Marylebone Road, Euston Road, King's Cross Road, following the natural valley that cuts across North London. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating from an engineering perspective. They decided to power this underground railway with steam locomotives in tunnels, 40 feet below ground, with limited ventilation opportunities. Think about this engineering decision for a moment. A steam locomotive works by burning coal or wood to heat water in a boiler, creating steam pressure that drives pistons that turn the wheels. This process produces enormous quantities of hot gases, coal smoke, ash, and various combustion byproducts. In the open air, these materials simply dispersed into the atmosphere, but in a confined underground tunnel, they would accumulate in ways that had never been tested before. The engineers weren't completely unaware of this challenge. They designed the locomotives with special condensing systems that were supposed to capture the steam and prevent it from escaping into the tunnels. The theory was that if you could condense the steam back into water, you could reduce the amount of visible vapor in the tunnels and make the journey more comfortable for passengers. But condensing the steam didn't address the coal smoke, the combustion gases, or the various other byproducts produced by burning fuel. And even the condensing systems didn't work as effectively as hoped. Victorian engineering was impressive for its ambition, but the execution often fell short of the theoretical designs. Construction of the Metropolitan Railway began in 1860 using a technique called cut and cover. This meant digging an enormous trench along the route, building the tunnel structure inside the trench, and then covering it over with soil and paving. It was the only practical way to build underground structures with 1860s technology, but it was also incredibly disruptive to the city above. For 3 years, central London experienced unprecedented construction chaos. Entire streets were excavated, down to depths of 20 or 30 feet, creating vast canyons where roads used to be. The noise was incredible. Steam shovels, controlled explosions, hundreds of workers with picks and shovels, horse-drawn carts hauling away thousands of tons of earth. And rock. The dust was everywhere, coating every building and filling the air with particles that people couldn't avoid encountering. But the most challenging aspect was what happened to the infrastructure above. When you dig a trench 30 feet deep underneath a city street, you inevitably encounter sewers, gas pipes, water mains, and all the other underground systems that keep a city functioning. Victorian London's infrastructure, such as it was frequently disrupted, creating complications that added to the general complexity of construction. Gas pipe incidents were particularly concerning. London's streets were lit by gas lamps, fed by an extensive network of underground pipes. When construction crews accidentally damaged these pipes, gas would accumulate in excavations and tunnels, creating hazardous conditions that caused workplace incidents regularly. The newspapers of the time are filled with reports of various mishaps during the construction of the Metropolitan Railway. Water management was another constant challenge. London sits on clay soil that becomes waterlogged very easily. The excavations frequently flooded, requiring steam pumps to run continuously to keep the work sites dry enough for construction to continue. These pumps added their own coal smoke and noise to the general complexity of the project. The working conditions for the men building the tunnels were extremely challenging by any standard. They worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, in excavations that were constantly threatening to collapse. Structural failures were a regular occurrence, creating dangerous situations for workers. The newspapers reported these incidents as routine, industrial hazards, rarely investigating the causes or suggesting improvements. The workers were mostly Irish immigrants and English agricultural laborers who had been displaced by the Industrial Revolution. They were paid very little and had virtually no safety protections. If a man was injured on the job, his family received no compensation and often faced immediate financial hardship. The attitude of the railway companies was that labor was abundant and replaceable, so individual worker welfare was not a priority. But somehow, despite all these challenges and setbacks, the tunnel got built. By late 1862, the Metropolitan Railway had a functioning underground tunnel running from Paddington to Farringdon, complete. With stations, signals, and track, the engineering achievement was genuinely remarkable. They had created the world's first underground passenger railway, proving that such a thing was actually feasible. The stations themselves were architectural, marvels that tried to bring some elegance and natural light into the underground environment. Baker Street Station, which survives in modified form today, featured elegant brick arches and large openings that allowed daylight to filter down from the street level. The platforms were spacious and well-designed, with clear signage and comfortable waiting areas, But all of this impressive infrastructure was about to be tested with steam locomotives producing coal smoke and various combustion products in enclosed spaces where passengers would have limited options for fresh air. The locomotives used on the Metropolitan Railway were specially designed for underground operation, but specially designed in this context meant modified versions of regular steam engines. They were smaller than typical long-distance locomotives and equipped with condensing systems that were supposed to reduce the amount of steam escaping into the tunnels. The condensing system worked by routing the exhaust steam through a network of tubes that were cooled by water, theoretically converting the steam back to liquid water that could be stored in tanks on the locomotive. This would reduce the visible clouds of steam and make the tunnels more pleasant for passengers. In practice, the condensing systems were only partially effective and did nothing about the coal smoke and combustion gases. Every time a locomotive climbed a grade or pulled a heavy load, the firemen would have to add more coal to the firebox, creating more smoke and more gases that had nowhere to disperse except into the tunnel atmosphere. The passenger cars were designed to be as well sealed as possible, with small windows and heavy doors that would theoretically protect passengers from the tunnel environment. But this created its own challenges. The cars became stuffy and uncomfortable, and if smoke did penetrate, it had no way to escape. Metropolitan Railway's first passenger trains were scheduled to begin service on January 10, 1863. The opening day was treated as a major civic celebration, with dignitaries, newspaper reporters, and curious members of the public lining up to experience this wonder of modern engineering. The first train left Paddington at 6 a.m. carrying a mixture of railway officials, journalists, and brave early passengers. The locomotive was the newest and best-maintained engine in the Metropolitan Railway's fleet, and the crew had been specially selected for their experience and reliability. For the first few minutes of the journey, everything seemed to work exactly as the engineers had planned. The train moved smoothly through the tunnel. The condensing system appeared to be managing most of the steam, and passengers in the well-sealed cars reported that the ride was comfortable and remarkably quiet compared to surface railways. But as the train continued through the tunnel, challenges began to develop. The locomotive was working harder as it climbed slight grades in the tunnel, requiring more coal to maintain speed. The fireman was adding fuel as needed, and the firebox was producing increasing quantities of smoke and combustion gases. The condensing system, which had worked adequately during initial testing with light loads, began to be overwhelmed. Steam started escaping from various joints and connections, creating visible clouds in the tunnel. More concerning, the coal smoke was accumulating in the tunnel atmosphere, with no effective way to clear it out. Passengers in the leading cars began to notice an unusual smell, not just coal smoke, but something more complex and unpleasant. The combustion of coal in a locomotive firebox produces not just steam and visible smoke, but also various chemical compounds. In an enclosed tunnel, these substances had nowhere to disperse except into the air that everyone was breathing. By the time the train reached King's Cross Station, about halfway through the journey, the tunnel atmosphere had become noticeably smoky. Passengers waiting on the platform could see clouds of steam and smoke swirling in the station, illuminated by the gas lamps that provided the only lighting. In the underground environment, the train that had left Paddington with such fanfare and optimism was now moving through an atmosphere that was becoming increasingly challenging. Passengers were beginning to cough and express discomfort about the air quality. Some reported feeling slightly dizzy or unwell, reactions that would later be understood as responses to poor air quality. But the Metropolitan Railway officials were committed to completing this inaugural journey successfully. Too much money and reputation had been invested in the project to acknowledge difficulties on the very first day. The train continued eastward toward Farringdon, pushing through tunnel air that was becoming steadily more contaminated with coal smoke and combustion products. The locomotive crew was experiencing the most challenging conditions of anyone on the train. The driver and firemen were working in an open cab at the front of the locomotive, directly exposed to whatever atmosphere existed in the tunnel. They had no protection, except their own endurance and whatever improvised breathing protection they could manage. Victorian railway workers were accustomed to harsh working conditions and exposure to coal smoke. It was simply part of the job. But working in an enclosed tunnel was different from working in the open air. The smoke and gases had nowhere to disperse, creating concentrations that challenged even experienced railwaymen. As the train approached Farringdon Station, the final stop on the inaugural journey, the tunnel atmosphere had become seriously compromised. Visibility was reduced by smoke and steam, and everyone on the train was breathing air that contained concerning levels of combustion byproducts. The train pulled into Farringdon Station to a crowd of curious onlookers and waiting journalists, but the celebration was somewhat muted by the obvious challenges with the tunnel atmosphere. Passengers disembarked, coughing and complaining about the air quality. Some reported headaches and feelings of unease that persisted for hours after leaving the underground environment. The newspaper coverage of the Metropolitan Railway's opening day was mixed. The engineering achievement was widely praised. London had successfully built and operated the world's first underground passenger railway, proving that such systems were technically feasible, but the challenges with air quality were impossible to ignore or minimize. The Times of London reported that the tunnel air was somewhat oppressive, and noted that passengers had expressed concerns about smoke and breathing difficulties. Other newspapers were more critical, with some suggesting that the Underground Railway was inherently problematic and should be reconsidered before it caused serious health issues. But Victorian London was desperate for better transportation, and the Metropolitan Railway, despite its obvious challenges, was still faster and more reliable than trying to cross the city by surface streets. The railway officially opened to the public on January 10, 1863, and despite the air quality issues, it was immediately popular with passengers who needed to travel between the major railway termini. The early passengers on the Metropolitan Railway were genuine pioneers. Testing new technology that had never been tried before, the air quality varied depending on train frequency, weather conditions, and the efficiency of the locomotives, but it was never what anyone would consider pleasant by modern standards. On busy days, when trains were running frequently through the tunnels, the air became thick with accumulated smoke and steam. The primitive ventilation systems couldn't keep up with the quantity of combustion products being generated by multiple locomotives operating in the enclosed environment. Weather made the situation more challenging. On calm days with no surface wind, there was no natural air circulation to help clear the tunnels. On rainy days, the ventilation shafts that were supposed to provide fresh air often became less effective. In winter, when passengers were wearing heavy clothing and the cars were more crowded, the combination of poor air quality and overcrowding created conditions that were genuinely uncomfortable. The locomotives themselves were constantly experiencing mechanical difficulties under the stress of underground operation. The condensing systems were complex and unreliable, requiring frequent repairs and maintenance. When a condensing system failed, a locomotive would produce enormous clouds of steam and smoke, turning the tunnel into something resembling the inside of a chimney. Locomotive failures in the tunnel created emergency situations that the Metropolitan Railway was not well equipped to handle. If a train broke down between stations, passengers were trapped in cars that were rapidly filling with smoke and steam. The only escape route was to walk through the tunnel to the nearest station, exposing passengers to the full concentration of combustion products in the tunnel atmosphere. Emergency procedures for locomotive failures were primitive and risky. Railway workers would have to enter the tunnel on foot to assess the situation and attempt repairs, often working in visibility so poor that they could barely see each other. Several workers were injured when they encountered other trains while working on disabled locomotives in the tunnels. The passenger cars themselves became challenging environments when locomotive failures occurred. The cars were designed to be well sealed to protect passengers from tunnel atmosphere, but this meant that when smoke did get inside, it had no way to escape. Passengers reported incidents where cars filled with dense smoke, forcing them to break windows or force open doors to get breathable air. Station platforms became refugees for passengers escaping from smoke-filled trains. But the stations themselves were not immune to air quality challenges. When locomotives idled in stations while loading and unloading passengers, they continued to produce smoke and steam that accumulated in the station environment. The gas lighting used in stations and tunnels created additional complications. Gas lamps consume oxygen and produce combustion products, adding to the already challenging atmosphere in the tunnels. When gas lamps were turned up to improve visibility in smoky conditions, they made the air quality worse by consuming more oxygen and producing more combustion byproducts. Station workers faced constant exposure to challenging air quality as part of their daily jobs. Platform attendants, ticket collectors, and maintenance workers spent their entire shifts breathing tunnel air that would be considered unacceptable. By modern standards, many station workers developed chronic respiratory problems that were directly related to their working environment. Coughing, shortness of breath, and chest discomfort were so common among Underground Railway employees that they were considered normal occupational challenges rather than signs of serious health issues. The Metropolitan Railways management was aware of the air quality challenges, but seemed to view them as minor inconveniences rather than serious safety issues. Their primary concern was maintaining service frequency and reliability, not necessarily protecting the health of passengers or workers. Various attempts were made to improve ventilation in the tunnels, but none were very effective. Ventilation shafts were added at regular intervals, but they often filled with smoke rather than providing fresh air. Mechanical ventilation systems powered by steam engines were installed, but these produced their own smoke and noise while providing minimal improvement in air quality. The most challenging situations occurred during rush hours, when train frequency was highest, and the tunnels were filled with smoke from multiple locomotives operating simultaneously. Morning and evening commuters faced the worst air quality conditions, breathing concentrated mixtures of coal smoke, steam, and combustion gases during their daily journeys. Passengers developed various strategies for surviving the underground journey. Some brought damp cloths to cover their faces, hoping to filter out some of the smoke and particles. Others tried to time their journeys to avoid the worst rush hour conditions. Many simply held their breath for as long as possible while the train was in the most problematic sections of tunnel. The social class divisions that characterized Victorian society were clearly visible in the Underground Railway's passenger accommodations. First-class cars were better sealed and had superior ventilation systems, providing some protection from the tunnel atmosphere. Third-class passengers rode in cars that were more directly exposed to smoke and fumes, making their journeys more challenging and uncomfortable. Wealthy passengers could afford to travel less frequently and during off-peak hours when air quality was somewhat better. Working-class commuters had no choice but to use the Underground Railway during rush hours. When conditions were at their worst, this meant that the people with the least ability to protect themselves from health hazards were exposed to the most challenging conditions. Women passengers faced particular difficulties in the underground environment. Victorian women's clothing included tight corsets that restricted breathing, making it even more difficult to cope with poor air quality. Fainting was common among female passengers, both from the restricted breathing caused by corsets and from the challenging atmosphere in the tunnels. Children were especially vulnerable to the effects of tunnel air quality. Their smaller body size meant that poor air affected them more quickly and severely than adults. Many families avoided bringing children on the Underground Railway except when absolutely necessary. Recognizing that the environment was particularly challenging for young passengers, the railway's medical officer, Dr. John Snow, the same doctor who had identified the cause of cholera in London, conducted studies of the health effects of underground railway travel. His reports documented cases of respiratory distress and various other health problems directly related to poor air quality in the tunnels. Dr. Snow's recommendations for improving air quality were largely ignored by railway management, who viewed them as expensive and unnecessary improvements to a system that was already operating profitably. The attitude was that if passengers were willing to pay for underground travel despite the discomfort, there was no business reason to spend money on improvements. The locomotives used on the Metropolitan Railway were constantly being modified in attempts to reduce their environmental impact. New designs for condensing systems were tried regularly, but none were completely successful in eliminating steam and smoke emissions in tunnel conditions. Some locomotives were equipped with special coal that was supposed to burn more cleanly and produce less smoke. These experiments had limited success and were expensive to implement. The railway found that specially processed coal cost significantly more than regular coal while providing only marginal improvements in smoke production. Coke, a processed form of coal that burns with less smoke, was tried as locomotive fuel but created its own challenges. Coke burns at higher temperatures than coal and produces different types of gases. Locomotive fireboxes designed for coal often could not handle the higher temperatures of coke combustion, leading to equipment failures and increased maintenance costs. The most serious incidents occurred when locomotives caught fire in the tunnels. Coal dust, oil, and other flammable materials used in locomotive operation could ignite, creating fires that filled the tunnels with dense, acrid smoke. Evacuation procedures for tunnel fires were primitive and often ineffective. When a locomotive fire occurred, the standard procedure was to try to push or pull the burning engine to the nearest station, where firefighting equipment was available. This meant that burning locomotives were often moved through tunnels while still on fire, spreading smoke and flames throughout the underground system. Firefighting in the tunnels was extremely difficult because of limited access and poor visibility. Fire brigades had to carry their equipment down narrow staircases and through smoke-filled tunnels to reach burning locomotives. Water used to fight fires often flooded the tunnels, creating additional hazards for evacuation and rescue efforts. Passengers trapped in tunnels during locomotive fires faced immediate life-threatening situations. The combination of fire, smoke, poor air quality, and limited escape routes created conditions where survival depended largely on luck and the quick actions of railway workers. Some of the most memorable accounts from the early Metropolitan Railway describe passengers' experiences. During tunnel emergencies, one passenger wrote of being trapped in a car filled with dense smoke while the train was stopped between stations for over an hour. He described breaking a window to get fresh air and helping other passengers who were overcome by fumes. Another account describes a locomotive incident in the tunnel near Baker Street Station. The incident affected the locomotive crew and filled several hundred yards of tunnel with steam and smoke. Passengers in the following cars had to evacuate through tunnels that were still filled with challenging gases and steam. Railway workers developed their own survival strategies for working in the underground environment. Many carried damp rags to cover their faces during the worst conditions. Some tried to work only during night shifts, when train frequency was lower and air quality was somewhat better. The psychological effects of working in the underground environment were significant, but largely ignored by railway management. Workers reported feelings of claustrophobia, anxiety, and depression that seemed to be related to spending long hours in the dark, smoke-filled tunnels. Some workers requested transfers to surface railway jobs, even when this meant lower pay and less job security. Underground railway work attracted men who were particularly desperate for employment, or who had few other options: Irish immigrants, displaced agricultural workers, and men with personal problems that made them unemployable elsewhere, often ended up working in the tunnels because no one else would take the jobs. The health impact on underground railway workers was significant but poorly documented. Workers who developed respiratory diseases or other health problems were rarely reported as railway casualties, making it difficult to assess the true human cost of underground operation. Working conditions improved gradually as the Metropolitan Railway gained experience with underground operations. But progress was slow and often driven more by equipment problems than concern for worker safety. When condensing systems were improved, it was usually because frequent failures were causing expensive delays rather than because of health concerns. The expansion of the Metropolitan Railway system in the 1860s and 1870s created new underground routes with the same fundamental challenges as the original line. Each new tunnel brought its own difficulties, and lessons learned on earlier lines were not always applied to new construction. The Circle Line, completed in 1884, was perhaps the most challenging underground railway project of the Victorian era. This line formed a complete loop around central London, connecting all the major railway termini in a continuous underground circle. The engineering achievement was remarkable, but the environmental conditions were worse than anything previously experienced. The Circle Line tunnels were deeper than earlier underground railways and had even less natural ventilation. When multiple steam trains operated on the circle simultaneously, the air quality became so poor that passengers regularly fainted or became ill during their journeys. One contemporary account describes a journey on the Circle Line during rush hour as traveling through industrial fog. The writer reported that visibility in the tunnels was so poor that signals could barely be seen, and the air was so thick with smoke that breathing was difficult and unpleasant. Station workers on the Circle Line developed a practice called air breaks, where they would leave their posts periodically to go above ground and breathe fresh air. This was not officially sanctioned by railway management, but supervisors generally tolerated it because workers who didn't take air breaks often collapsed from smoke inhalation. The depth of Circle Line tunnels made emergency evacuation particularly challenging. If a train broke down or caught fire in the deep tunnels, passengers faced long climbs up narrow emergency staircases while breathing air that was often thick with smoke and combustion products. By the 1880s, it was becoming clear that steam-powered underground railways had reached the limits of safe operation. The combination of increasing train frequency, deeper tunnels, and London's growing population had created conditions that were becoming genuinely challenging for regular passengers. The solution came in the form of electric traction. Electric locomotives produced no smoke, no steam, and no combustion gases. They were quieter, cleaner, and much safer for underground operation. But the transition from steam to electric power was slow and expensive, requiring complete reconstruction of the electrical infrastructure throughout the underground system. The first electric underground railway in London was the City and South London Railway, opened in 1890. This line demonstrated that underground railways could operate safely and comfortably without the environmental hazards of steam power. But it took many years to convert the existing steam-powered lines to electric operation. During the transition period in the 1890s and early 1900s, passengers could experience both steam and electric underground trains on the same day. The contrast was dramatic. Electric trains were quiet, clean, and comfortable, while steam trains continued to fill tunnels with smoke and noise. The last steam-powered passenger train operated on the London Underground in 1905, marking the end of over 40 years of passengers accepting challenging conditions every time they travelled underground. The conversion to electric power eliminated the worst environmental hazards of underground travel, but it came too late for the thousands of passengers and workers who had been exposed to difficult conditions during the steam era. The health effects of exposure to underground steam railway conditions were never properly studied or documented. Victorian medical understanding of occupational health hazards was limited, and there was little interest in investigating the long-term effects of breathing coal smoke and combustion gases. Many former underground railway workers and regular passengers developed chronic respiratory problems that may have been related to their exposure to tunnel air pollution. Conditions like pneumoconiosis were recognized in coal miners, but similar conditions in railway workers were not generally acknowledged or compensated. The Metropolitan Railway's financial success, despite its environmental challenges, demonstrated the desperate need for better urban transportation in Victorian London. Passengers were willing to accept difficult conditions to avoid the even worse conditions of surface travel through London's congested and polluted streets. The Underground Railway's popularity also reflected the Victorian attitude toward industrial hazards. People accepted challenging working and travelling conditions as the inevitable price of industrial progress. The idea that technology should be safe as well as functional was not yet part of the Victorian engineering mindset. Modern visitors to the London Underground system would find it difficult to imagine the conditions that passengers faced during the steam era. Today's electric trains are clean, quiet, and safe, with sophisticated ventilation systems that maintain good air quality even in deep tunnels, but traces of the steam era can still be found in the London Underground system. Some of the original Victorian tunnel sections remain in use, with their distinctive brick arches and ventilation shafts that were designed for a very different type of railway operation. The engineering lessons learned during the steam-powered Underground Railway era contributed to the development of safer underground transportation systems around the world. The challenges encountered in London's early underground railways influenced the design of subway systems in New York, Paris, and other major cities. The Victorian Underground Railway experience also contributed to the development of occupational health and safety regulations. The obvious health hazards faced by underground railway workers helped establish the principle that employers had some responsibility for protecting workers from industrial hazards. Looking back at the Victorian Underground Railway system, it's remarkable that it worked at all. The idea of running steam locomotives through underground tunnels was so fundamentally challenging that it's surprising more people weren't seriously injured. But it also represents the extraordinary ambition and determination of Victorian engineers, who were willing to tackle seemingly impossible problems. The passengers who rode those early underground trains were genuine pioneers, accepting health and safety risks to test new technology that would eventually revolutionize urban transportation. Their willingness to endure challenging and uncomfortable conditions made possible the development of safe, efficient underground railway systems that millions of people use every day. The story of Victorian London's Underground Railway is ultimately a story about the price of progress. Every major technological advance involves risks and sacrifices, and someone has to be willing to pay those costs to move civilization forward. The people who built and rode London's steam-powered underground trains paid a significant price in health and safety, but their sacrifices made possible the underground transportation systems that we take for granted today. As you settle into your comfortable bed tonight, breathing clean air in a safe environment, think about those Victorian passengers who descended into smoke-filled tunnels every day to travel across London. They faced conditions that would be considered immediately unacceptable by modern standards. But they did it anyway because they believed that progress was worth the risk. The engineering challenges of steam-powered underground railways seem obvious in retrospect, but they weren't obvious to the brilliant engineers who designed them. Those engineers were working at the limits of 19th century technology, trying to solve problems that had never been solved before. They made mistakes, but they also made breakthrough achievements that changed the world. The next time you ride a subway or underground train anywhere in the world, remember that you're using a technology that was pioneered by people who were willing to breathe coal smoke and risk their health in primitive tunnels deep beneath London. Their courage and determination made possible the safe, comfortable underground transportation that we enjoy today. The Victorian Underground Railway reminds us that progress is not always smooth or safe. Sometimes achieving breakthrough technologies requires accepting risks that later generations would find unacceptable. But without people willing to take those risks, we would never advance beyond existing limitations. The smoke has long since cleared from London's underground tunnels. The steam locomotives that once filled those passages with challenging fumes have been replaced by clean, quiet electric trains. But the courage and ingenuity of the people who made the Underground Railway possible should never be forgotten. Close your eyes now and imagine yourself descending into one of those Victorian underground stations, with its elegant brick arches and gas lighting. Feel the rumble of an approaching steam train, see the clouds of smoke and steam swirling in the station, hear the hiss of the condensing system and the roar of the locomotive's firebox. Now imagine stepping into one of those primitive passenger cars. Knowing that you're about to travel through tunnels filled with smoke and combustion products, feel the train begin to move, carrying you into the darkness beneath London's streets, where the air grows thick and your breathing becomes more labored. But also feel the excitement of being part of something completely new and revolutionary. You're riding on the world's first underground railway, experiencing technology that will change the way people live and work in cities everywhere. You're a pioneer in the development of modern urban transportation. The journey through those smoke-filled tunnels was challenging and uncomfortable, but it was also magnificent in its ambition and achievement. The Victorian engineers who built the Underground Railway were reaching for something that had never existed before, and they succeeded despite incredible obstacles and difficulties. Rest now in your safe, comfortable environment, breathing clean air and surrounded by the products of more than a century of technological progress since those first underground trains began running beneath London. But remember the price that was paid for that progress, and honor the memory of the people who were willing to descend into the darkness so that future generations could travel safely underground. The tunnels are still there, deep beneath London's streets. They're clean and safe now, filled with electric trains that carry millions of passengers every year without discomfort or health concerns. But they began as something much more primitive, and challenging, smoke-filled passages where people accepted health risks every time they traveled from one station to another. The story of London's Underground Railway is a story of human courage, ingenuity, and determination triumphing over seemingly impossible challenges. It's also a story of the price we sometimes have to pay for progress, and the willingness of some people to take risks so that others can benefit from technological advances. Sweet dreams, and remember to appreciate the clean air you're breathing and the safe environment you're sleeping in. Those Victorian Underground Railway passengers would consider your comfortable bedroom a paradise compared to the smoke-filled tunnels they endured to travel across their city. Their sacrifices made possible the world we live in today,